security.
Just an hour.
The story opens in the colorful heart of Punjab, Pakistan, where a grand wedding is underway, filled with music, celebration, and family. During the festivities, we are introduced to Cameron, who arrives at his father's residence for an important conversation. His father, Amir Barkawi, is far more dangerous than he first appears. Behind his wealthy and powerful image, he controls a massive international criminal empire. As the plot begins to unfold, intelligence agencies from the G7 identify Barkawi as a highly wanted Pakistani arms dealer and terrorist with global reach. Once his location is confirmed, officials approve a U.S. Air Force drone strike without delay, but the attack lands during Barkawi's daughter's wedding, turning a joyful occasion into a devastating tragedy and causing the deaths of many innocent people. The film then jumps ahead 2 years. In the United States, Mike is out jogging with President Benjamin Asher. As they run, the two discuss political issues and the pressures surrounding the president's role. Afterward, Mike returns home, where his wife is preparing for the arrival of their baby. With fatherhood so close, Mike begins questioning whether he can continue living the dangerous life of a Secret Service agent. The thought weighs heavily on him, and he even begins typing a resignation email, ready to step away for the sake of his family. Before he can complete it, the focus shifts to President Asher, who receives an alarming phone call. He is informed that James Wilson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has suddenly died after complications from surgery. The news hits him hard, especially because the funeral will require the attendance of world leaders from across the globe. The scene then moves to London, where elite security officials gather to prepare for the massive international event. With so many powerful leaders expected in one place, every agency understands the risk. Back in New York, Mike arrives at his office and meets Lynn. Together, they warn President Asher that traveling to London could expose him to serious danger. But Asher refuses to back down. He believes his presence at the funeral is not optional, but necessary. As Mike leaves the meeting, he briefly runs into Vice President Alan Trumbull. Later, Mike returns home and promises his wife that once this assignment is finished, he will leave the job behind. Soon after, he joins President Asher as they depart for London. During the journey, Lynn places Mike in charge of the president's overseas security detail, making it clear that everything must be handled perfectly. Meanwhile, in London, the head of security addresses his team. He briefs them on the situation and reminds everyone of the seriousness of their mission. They are not simply guarding one official, they are responsible for protecting some of the most powerful people on Earth. Air Force One lands at Stansted Airport earlier than scheduled, catching John, the security chief, by surprise. Mike quickly calms him down, explaining that the fewer people who know the president's exact movements, the better their chances of keeping him safe. London has been transformed into a lockdown fortress. Police officers line the streets, helicopters patrol overhead, and snipers are positioned across the city. At the same time, leaders from several nations are arriving for the funeral. When President Asher reaches the city, he is greeted respectfully by other dignitaries. But behind the formal welcome, danger is already moving into place. A man dressed as a police officer secretly plants an explosive device on the Canadian Prime Minister's vehicle. Seconds later, the car erupts in a massive explosion, sending shockwaves through the area. Almost at the same moment, men disguised as the King's Guard suddenly open fire, killing the German chancellor along with several innocent civilians. It quickly becomes clear that terrorists have infiltrated London's security forces, disguising themselves as Metropolitan Police officers and royal guards. As President Asher approaches the cathedral, heavily armed mercenaries appear from hidden positions and launch a full-scale attack. The streets explode into chaos. Vehicles detonate one after another, gunfire tears through the crowd, and the entrance to the cathedral is blocked off, leaving the president trapped outside. Mike reacts instantly. He takes down multiple attackers, then moves with Asher toward cover behind an SUV. From there, he continues fighting off the assault, keeping the president alive while enemies close in from every direction. Another armored threat enters the fight, but Mike uses quick thinking and sharp instincts to neutralize it before it can cause more damage. Then 2 ambulances race onto a nearby bridge. Within seconds, both vehicles explode. The blast is so powerful that the bridge begins to break apart and collapse. In the destruction, the Japanese official is killed. Elsewhere, the Italian Prime Minister, terrified and hiding inside a chapel, is caught in another explosion and dies instantly. The coordinated attack continues across the city, as the French president's boat is blown apart on the water in a fiery blast. Back in the streets, a vehicle is sent to rescue Ben and Mike. They jump inside immediately and speed away, desperate to escape the war zone London has become, but the attackers are already waiting. Bullets hammer the car from all sides. The driver manages to fight back with the vehicle itself, forcing one enemy car off the road, but then a group of motorbikes surrounds them. During the chase, one biker crashes violently and is thrown straight through the bulletproof glass. The impact creates an opening, allowing the attackers to fire inside the vehicle. The driver is hit, leaving Mike and the president in even greater danger as the escape becomes more desperate. With the driver wounded and no safer option left, Mike climbs behind the wheel and takes control of the car himself. He moves fast, steering through the attack with precision while forcing several pursuers out of the chase. More motorbikes close in, but Mike keeps the vehicle moving just ahead of them, using every opening in the street to survive. After wiping out the remaining attackers, he and President Asher finally reach a waiting helicopter. They board quickly, and within moments, the chopper lifts off, carrying them away from the chaos below. The scene shifts to a news report, where broadcasters deliver the grim aftermath of the London assault. The attack has left the world stunned. 5 major world leaders, including presidents and prime ministers, have been killed. As the news spreads, the story turns to Amir Barkawi, the man behind the entire operation. Despite the drone strike from years earlier, he is still alive. He contacts his son, who remains calm and confident, assuring him that every part of their plan is moving exactly as intended. Soon after, Cameron escalates the attack even further by cutting power across the city, throwing London into complete darkness. In the United States Command Center, Vice President Alan Trumbull orders the nearest available units to respond, but the closest forces are still 2 hours away. That means Mike and the president are almost completely on their own. The terrorists continue hunting them from the ground and the air. As the president's helicopter flies over London, the attackers lock onto it. One of the escort choppers is destroyed under heavy fire. The president's helicopter releases flares to avoid incoming missiles, but the attacks keep coming, and their defenses begin to run out. In a desperate move, another escort helicopter draws a missile toward itself, sacrificing its crew to protect the president. But the danger is not over. A Stinger missile finally strikes the president's helicopter, sending it spinning out of control before it crashes violently into a park. Back in the command center, American officials watch the disaster unfold in shock. Against all odds, Mike and President Asher survive the crash, injured but still alive. Lynn, however, is not as fortunate. With her last moments, she tells Mike to keep going and protect the president no matter what. Mike and Asher climb out of the wreckage and immediately try to contact their security team, but the communication lines are dead. Realizing enemies will be closing in fast, they leave the crash site and disappear into the nearby wooded area, using the darkness and trees to stay hidden. At the command center, Vice President Trumbull receives a call he never expected. It is Barkawi, alive and fully in control of the terror unfolding across London. Speaking with cold confidence, Barkawi explains that everything happening now is revenge for the drone strike that killed his daughter. He gives Alan a choice. Surrender President Asher to him, and the attack will stop. But Trumbull refuses without hesitation, making it clear that the United States will not bargain with terrorists. Meanwhile, Mike and Asher continue moving through the city. When they encounter a police officer, Mike suddenly attacks and disables him. Asher is shocked and questions why he would do that, but Mike quickly points out the man's weapons and gear, proving he is not a real officer at all. He then tells Asher there is an M. Essex safe house nearby where they might be able to take shelter. With no better option, the two head toward the subway. Their escape is interrupted when more attackers appear. Mike reacts quickly, throwing a smoke bomb to blind and confuse them. In the confusion, he launches a grenade, then finishes off the 3 enemies left helpless on the ground. Moments later, a radio from one of the dead attackers starts crackling. Mike picks it up and realizes Cameron is on the other end. Instead of staying silent, Mike uses the moment to send a message. He forces Cameron to listen as he kills Cameron's brother, making it brutally clear that anyone who comes for the president will not walk away. Back at the command center, Alan studies a satellite image and notices the way Mike is holding his gun. Trumbull immediately understands that Mike is sending a coded signal meant for M. Essex. Acting fast, he searches for nearby M. Essex safe houses, hoping to identify where Mike and Asher are heading. As they continue through the city, Asher understands how dangerous their situation has become. He makes a grim request to Mike. If capture becomes unavoidable, he does not want to be taken alive and executed on camera for the world to watch. He asks Mike to kill him first rather than let the terrorists use him as a symbol. Soon after, British officials make contact with Trumbull. Together, they come up with a tactical plan. All official first responders will be pulled off the streets. That way, anyone still moving through the area in uniform can be treated as hostile, giving the military permission to eliminate them without hesitation. Mike and President Asher finally reach the M. Issac safe house, where Agent Jacqueline Marshall meets them at the entrance. She moves quickly, bringing them inside and securing the building. Once they are settled, Marshall plays a coded voice message for them. The message is from Alan Trumbull, and it includes details only he, Mike, and Asher would know, confirming that it is truly him. Alan explains that an armored convoy is on the way to extract the president safely. Marshall then reveals who is really behind the attacks. When President Asher hears Barkawa's name, his expression shifts with recognition and regret. He understands the connection immediately and seems painfully aware that this violence traces back to the drone strike that destroyed Barkawa's family. A short time later, the safe house alert system signals that a team has arrived outside. Mike checks the security cameras, but something about the scene feels wrong. He zooms in, studies the men carefully, and realizes they are not the rescue team. They are enemies pretending to be friendly forces. Without wasting a second, Mike moves to the armory and prepares for the attack that is about to come. Mike orders Asher and Marshall to stay low and get behind cover. There is no time to explain anything. The fake rescue team is already moving in, and Mike immediately opens fire. He drops the first mercenary quickly, but the second one puts up a stronger fight, forcing Mike into a close and dangerous exchange. At the same time, another attacker below notices the movement and joins the assault. Mike keeps moving with controlled precision. He slides across the floor, changes angles, and takes down several more enemies before they can surround him. Just as one attacker nearly gets the advantage, Mike turns the situation around and overpowers him. With the safe house no longer secure, Mike, Asher, and Marshall rush toward an underground vehicle, ready to escape before more enemies arrive. While Mike and the president try to stay alive, Agent Marshall begins digging into the security breach, determined to discover who has been passing information to the attackers. At the same time, American officials finally make a major breakthrough. They identify Barkawa's location by tracing a property that appears abandoned, but is using far more electricity than it should. The building is also connected to one of Barkawa's old business operations, giving them the confirmation they need. Meanwhile, Mike and President Asher race through the streets of London. When they spot enemies blocking the road ahead, Asher slams down on the accelerator. Gunfire erupts around them, bullets tear into nearby vehicles, and cars burst into flames, but they keep pushing forward. Then, without warning, a truck smashes into them from the side. The impact flips their car over violently. Attackers rush toward the wreckage and manage to seize President Asher. Mike fights back hard, but there are too many of them. Just when the situation seems impossible, Trumbull's strike team arrives at the scene. Mike quickly tells them that the president has been taken, and without wasting time, they prepare to launch a rescue operation. Back at London's security headquarters, Agent Marshall restores their surveillance system using a special access code. The move surprises everyone in the room. They are confused by how she pulled it off, but also impressed by how quickly she regains control of the system. In a deserted warehouse, President Asher is tied up and held prisoner. Cameron stands over him with complete confidence, promising that the world is about to watch his execution. What Cameron does not realize is that Mike and the rescue team are already positioned outside the building. Mike's radio comes alive. The chief inspector warns him to slow down, explaining that nearly 100 armed men are inside. But Mike is not interested in waiting. The president is running out of time, and the attack begins. Mike and the team advance with discipline and force, moving through the outer defenses while taking down enemies one by one. The fight intensifies when an RPG is fired in their direction, but even that fails to stop them. A sentry gun suddenly activates, threatening to cut them down, but Mike reacts fast and destroys it with a grenade. The team keeps pushing forward. Mike eliminates enemies with ruthless focus while the others support him from outside. They use an RPG to destroy enemy gunners and knock out the building's generator, plunging the area into darkness. With the lights down, Mike gets the opening he needs to enter the building. Inside, he puts on night vision goggles and plants C4 beside a gas line. Moving quietly through the shadows, he takes out several attackers before they even realize he is there. At one point, Mike blends in just long enough to move among the enemies, pretending to be one of them until the power comes back on. But even with the lights restored, they still cannot stop him. He fights his way through the building, cutting down anyone who blocks his path. During the assault, Mike is shot, but he keeps going. He uses grenades, firearms, and anything within reach to clear the way toward the president. At the same time, Cameron begins the live broadcast. The world is about to see President Asher humiliated and killed on camera. Cameron beats him while Asher calmly repeats the words of the presidential oath, refusing to give his captors the fear they want. Then Cameron picks up a sword and prepares to finish it. At the very last second, Mike storms into the room, firing at every armed man inside. He takes them all down, but by the time he reaches Cameron, his weapon is empty. With no bullets left, Mike faces him directly. The fight turns brutal. Mike gains the upper hand at first, but Cameron manages to stab him in the stomach. Even wounded, Mike refuses to fall. He keeps fighting and begins beating Cameron savagely, driving him back with pure determination. Then Cameron's brother throws a grenade, giving Cameron the chance to escape. Mike and Asher struggle to get up and run. As they move through the building, enemies continue appearing from every direction. They fight through wave after wave, but eventually they become trapped, with gunmen firing at them from both sides. With no clean way out, Mike contacts his team outside and orders them to detonate the C4. The explosive goes off, igniting the gas line and sending fire tearing through the building. As flames rush through the structure, Mike and Asher jump into an elevator shaft to survive the blast. The explosion kills Cameron and sets the entire building on fire. Moments later, U.S. troops storm the burning building and search the area. They reach the elevator shaft and find Mike and President Asher lying at the bottom, bruised, exhausted, and injured, but alive. When they are brought out, President Asher salutes Mike for his courage and loyalty. Mike then hands his men a device he recovered during the fight, telling them it may lead them to Amir Barkawa's location. The story then shifts back to Agent Marshall. She confronts MI5 of Intelligence Chief John after uncovering the truth. He was Barkawa's inside source. His fingerprints in the security system exposed him. John tries to defend what he did, claiming he wanted to prove how vulnerable the nation had become because of its military budget and security weaknesses. Marshall has no patience for his excuses and kills him. Elsewhere, Barkawi receives a phone call. It is Alan Trumbull. In a calm but final tone, Alan tells him that his plan has failed. Barkawi refuses to accept defeat and warns him that this is only the beginning. Alan's answer is simple and chilling. He tells him to look outside. Before Barkawi can do anything, a drone strike hits his compound, destroying him and wiping out what remains of his organization. 2 weeks later, London is slowly recovering. The city has been wounded, but it is beginning to rebuild. Mike returns home, finally taking time to be with Lai and their newborn daughter. They name the baby Lynn, honoring the friend who gave her life protecting the president. As Mike sits with his family, he once again thinks about leaving the Secret Service behind. His resignation letter is still waiting. But then he sees Alan Trumbull speaking on television, reminding the country of its strength and resilience. Something changes in Mike. With renewed purpose, he deletes the resignation email. Before getting into the actual chaos of London Has Fallen, it's worth looking at where this movie sits in the franchise, because that already explains a lot. This is the middle chapter of the Has Fallen trilogy. First came Olympus Has Fallen in 2013, then London Has Fallen in 2016, and later Angel Has Fallen in 2019. So by the time this sequel arrived, Mike Banning was already being shaped into a proper action franchise hero. The thing is, Olympus Has Fallen worked for some people because it had that guilty pleasure energy. It was ridiculous, sure, but it had a certain blunt force charm. It was violent, simple, and basically a die-hard style setup with Gerard Butler thrown into the middle of it. Not original, but entertaining enough if you accepted what it was. London Has Fallen tries to go bigger. Bigger location, bigger threat, more leaders in danger, more destruction, more explosions. But bigger is not always better. That's where the sequel starts to feel questionable. You can almost feel the movie asking, what if we do the same thing again, but this time destroy London? And for some viewers, that is enough. They want Banning back, they want the president in danger again, they want the chaos turned up. Fair enough. As popcorn action, that formula has an audience. But the problem is that the first film already felt like a limited concept. It was not exactly built on a deep mythology or an iconic hero with endless storytelling potential. Mike Banning is tough, loyal, and aggressive, but he is not written with the same personality or lasting identity as the great action heroes this franchise clearly wants to echo. So London Has Fallen becomes this strange sequel that is both unnecessary and completely understandable. Unnecessary because it does not really evolve the idea much. Understandable because studios know this kind of action sells. Recognizable star, simple mission, global threat, lots of damage. And that is probably the best way to see its place in the franchise. It is not here to reinvent anything. It is here to repeat the formula at a louder volume. For fans, that makes it a fun continuation. For critics, that makes it proof that this series was already running out of fresh ideas by its second chapter. The setup of London Has Fallen is simple, and honestly, that is part of why the movie moves the way it does. The British Prime Minister dies, and his funeral becomes a major international event. Leaders from different countries are expected to attend, including the President of the United States, Benjamin Asher. Naturally, that means Mike Banning is there too, because wherever Asher goes, Banning is basically the human insurance policy standing beside him. At first, the whole thing has the shape of a political thriller, a sudden death, a high-security funeral, world leaders gathering in one place, a city preparing for something important. You can feel the film trying to build tension from that idea alone, and then everything goes wrong. The funeral is not just a funeral, it is a trap. The terrorists use the event to launch a massive coordinated attack, targeting world leaders and turning London into a battlefield. Police, emergency services, public streets, landmarks, everything gets pulled into the chaos. Within minutes, the film stops pretending to be calm and becomes a full survival mission. From that point on, the story is not complicated. Banning has one job: protect President Asher and get him out alive. That directness gives the movie its engine. There is no need to pause for a deep mystery or a layered investigation. The president is in danger, the city is unsafe, and Banning has to keep moving. It is a very old-school action setup, almost proudly basic, but that also means the movie depends heavily on how much you buy into the situation. If the attack feels intense to you, the setup works. If it feels too impossible, the whole thing starts to look ridiculous very quickly. Still, as a premise, it is built for action. A global crisis squeezed into one city. A hero cut off from safe backup. A president being hunted in real time. It is not subtle storytelling, but it gives the film a clear direction. And in a movie like this, clear direction matters. London Has Fallen does not waste much time pretending to be something deeper. Once the trap is sprung, the film basically says, here is the mission, here are the enemies, now run. When it comes to the writing, London Has Fallen is one of those movies that almost tells you exactly what it is within the first half hour. This is not a story built around surprises. It is not trying to outsmart the audience. In fact, most viewers will probably figure out where everything is heading long before the movie gets there. And honestly, that's not automatically a problem. Some action films survive perfectly well on a simple foundation. The issue here is not that the story is straightforward. The issue is that it rarely finds a way to make that straightforward story feel fresh. Almost every major development follows a path you can see coming from miles away. The president is in danger. Banning refuses to quit. The terrorists seem one step ahead. A trusted system fails. The hero gets trapped. The hero escapes. The hero keeps moving. If you've watched enough action movies, the rhythm becomes familiar very quickly. What surprised me wasn't how predictable it was. It was how comfortable the movie seemed with being predictable. There are moments where it feels like the screenplay isn't interested in building suspense because it assumes the audience is only waiting for the next explosion anyway. Instead of creating unexpected turns, it mostly focuses on pushing the characters from one action sequence to another. That's why the film often feels less like a thriller and more like a delivery system for action scenes. The political setup at the beginning actually hints at something bigger. A world leader dies unexpectedly. International tensions are already present. Multiple governments are involved. There's room there for intrigue, paranoia, maybe even a deeper conspiracy angle. But the movie never really explores those possibilities. It quickly narrows its focus until everything becomes extremely simple. Identify the bad guys, keep the president alive, and survive long enough to reach the final confrontation. Again, there is nothing wrong with simplicity by itself. Some of the best action films ever made are built on simple objectives. The difference is that those films usually find creative ways to develop tension along the journey. London Has Fallen often takes the shortest route possible. The characters are generally written to serve the plot rather than the other way around. Decisions happen because the movie needs them to happen. Information appears when the movie needs information. Obstacles appear when the action needs another obstacle. It creates a feeling that the screenplay is constantly pushing pieces around a board rather than allowing events to unfold naturally. Even Mike Banning's personal storyline feels surprisingly thin. Early on, there is an opportunity to explore his future, his family, and the possibility of leaving this dangerous life behind. It's actually one of the few moments where the character feels like a real person rather than an action machine. Then the attack starts, and from that point forward, those ideas mostly disappear into the background. The film repeatedly chooses momentum over character development. Whether that's a flaw or a strength depends entirely on what you're looking for. Fans of straightforward action may appreciate that the movie never slows down for emotional detours. Others may feel like the story leaves potential on the table. What I found most interesting is that the movie constantly wants the audience to take the stakes seriously while refusing to treat its own story with the same seriousness. The threats are global, the consequences are supposedly enormous, entire governments are affected, yet the writing often operates with the logic of a comic book action adventure where everything exists primarily to keep the hero moving forward. That creates a strange disconnect. The movie talks like a serious political thriller, but behaves like an old-school action fantasy. Sometimes that combination works. Sometimes it becomes unintentionally funny. By the end, the screenplay feels less interested in asking questions than delivering satisfaction. The good guys win. The bad guys lose. The mission gets completed. The audience gets the payoff it was always going to get. There's a certain honesty in that approach, even if it limits how memorable the story ultimately becomes. Because when you look back on London Has Fallen, it's hard to remember specific plot developments. What sticks in your mind are the situations, the destruction, the escapes, and the action itself. And maybe that's the clearest summary of the writing. The story isn't really the attraction, it's the track that the action rides on. The biggest problem with London Has Fallen is not that it is unrealistic. Plenty of action movies are unrealistic. That is almost part of the contract. We know the hero is going to survive things no normal person should survive. We know bullets will miss at convenient moments. We know explosions will happen at just the right distance for maximum drama and minimum consequence. That is fine. That is action movie language. The issue with London Has Fallen is that it keeps asking for more belief than the movie has earned. At some point, you stop thinking, okay, this is exaggerated, and you start thinking, come on, seriously. The whole attack on London is built like an impossible magic trick. Terrorists are everywhere. They have infiltrated police units, emergency services, security routes, official systems, and somehow every important corner of the city. They are not just prepared. They are almost supernaturally prepared. Wherever the president goes, they seem to already be waiting. And yes, a movie like this needs danger around every corner. But here, it starts to feel less like a dangerous situation and more like the script simply placing enemies wherever it needs them. That makes the world feel fake. British security also takes a huge hit in this movie. The entire system is shown as either useless, compromised, or completely unable to respond. For the story to work, London basically has to collapse in minutes. Police have to fail. Intelligence has to fail. Emergency response has to fail. Every layer of protection has to break at the exact same time. After a while, it becomes hard to take seriously. And then there is Mike Banning himself. Gerard Butler plays him with enough force that you understand why the movie trusts him so much. He looks like the kind of guy who can take a punch, fire back, and keep moving. But the film pushes that idea so far that Banning stops feeling like a highly trained Secret Service agent and starts feeling like a bulletproof machine. Helicopter danger, car crashes, explosions, grenades, gun battles, close combat. He keeps walking through things that should end the movie immediately. Maybe he gets a scratch. Maybe he looks tired for a second. Then he is back to killing bad guys like nothing happened. It is entertaining in a very blunt way, but it kills suspense. Because if the hero can survive almost anything, what are we supposed to fear? That is where believability becomes more than just a realism complaint. It affects tension. It affects stakes. It affects whether the audience feels involved or simply watches the madness from a distance. The strange thing is, London Has Fallen sometimes seems to want the weight of a serious thriller. The attack is massive. The political consequences are huge. The president is threatened in front of the world. The movie wants us to feel that this is a terrifying global crisis, but the logic is so stretched that the seriousness keeps slipping away. It is like watching a film that wants to be grounded and cartoonish at the same time. If it had fully embraced the absurdity, maybe it would feel cleaner. If it had leaned into a comic book action tone, the impossible survival moments and exaggerated terrorist plan might be easier to accept. But because the film keeps presenting everything with a straight face, the ridiculous parts stand out even more. That does not mean there is no fun in it. For some viewers, the unreal quality is exactly the appeal. This is the kind of movie where you switch off your brain, accept that Banning is basically made of steel, and enjoy the chaos. You are not there to audit the security failures. You are there to see the hero fight through a city under siege. And on that level it can work, but if you need the story to pass even a basic smell test, London Has Fallen becomes exhausting. Every few minutes, something happens that feels too convenient, too impossible, or too obviously designed just to keep the action moving. That is the line the movie keeps crossing. It does not just bend reality, it keeps punching reality in the face and expecting us not to notice. One thing I'll give London Has Fallen credit for is that it understands exactly what kind of movie it wants to be. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends entirely on your tolerance for this style of action filmmaking. The movie actually starts slower than I expected. Not painfully slow, but there is definitely a stretch early on where it's setting up the funeral, reintroducing Mike Banning, checking in with President Asher, and putting all the pieces into position. For a brief moment, it almost feels like it's preparing to be a political thriller. Then the attack happens, and from that point forward, the movie practically hits the accelerator and forgets where the brakes are. The pacing becomes relentless. Shootout follows shootout. Escape leads directly into another ambush. Characters barely have time to catch their breath before the next problem arrives. The film keeps pushing forward with the energy of someone sprinting downhill and hoping everything works out. Honestly, there were moments where I admired that commitment. A lot of modern blockbusters stop every 10 minutes to explain themselves. They pause for exposition. They remind the audience what's happening. They overcomplicate things. London Has Fallen doesn't really do that. Its philosophy seems to be, keep moving and don't let people think about it too much. Sometimes that approach works surprisingly well. Even when the story starts stretching credibility, the momentum can carry you through scenes that probably shouldn't work. You're already on to the next chase, the next firefight, the next escape route before you've had time to fully process what just happened. That's a useful trick, but it's also the movie's biggest weakness, because non-stop pacing and good pacing are not always the same thing. There were points where I felt like the film was confusing activity with excitement. Just because something is happening every minute doesn't automatically mean those moments are becoming more thrilling. Eventually, the constant intensity starts flattening out. When everything is loud, nothing feels especially loud. When every scene is life or death, individual moments stop feeling urgent. The movie rarely slows down long enough to create anticipation. Instead of building tension and releasing it, it mostly stays at the same elevated level for long stretches. Some viewers will love that because there's almost no downtime. Others may find it oddly exhausting, and that's where the entertainment value becomes really interesting. I've seen people absolutely hate this movie while still admitting they weren't bored. That's a strange achievement. There are films that are technically better but less watchable. London Has Fallen often operates on pure momentum. You may roll your eyes at the logic. You may laugh at some of the absurd situations. You may question almost every decision being made, yet the movie keeps moving. For action fans, that's often enough. If you're looking for something deep, something layered, something that rewards close attention, this probably isn't the movie you're looking for. But if your goal is to spend 90+ minutes watching Gerard Butler run through a collapsing city while shooting bad guys and surviving impossible situations, the film delivers exactly that. No more, no less. I think that's why reactions to the movie are so extreme. Some viewers see a dumb action film that never pretends to be anything else and judge it on those terms. Others see missed potential everywhere and become frustrated by what it could have been. Both reactions make sense, because London Has Fallen is one of those rare movies where your enjoyment depends less on what the film is doing and more on what you expect from it before pressing play. If you show up wanting realism, you'll probably be irritated. If you show up wanting a loud, fast-moving action spectacle that keeps throwing explosions at the screen until the credits roll, there's a decent chance you'll have fun. The movie knows which audience it's chasing. The question is whether you're part of that audience or not. Action is really the main reason London Has Fallen exists, not the politics, not the character drama, not the mystery behind the attack. The movie is built around movement, impact, and damage. Once the funeral turns into a trap, the film becomes a long chain of shootouts, explosions, vehicle chases, emergency escapes, and close-range violence. And to be fair, for viewers who came only for that, the movie does deliver. There is always something happening. Streets are being torn apart, helicopters are under threat, cars are being chased through danger. Banning and Asher are forced from one unsafe location to another, and every possible escape route seems to turn into another combat zone. It is not elegant action, exactly, but it is busy, aggressive, and constantly trying to keep the pressure on. The film has that old-school, survive the gauntlet structure. Banning is not solving the crisis in a calm, strategic way. He is fighting through it one body at a time. That gives the action a simple, blunt energy. He shoots, runs, fights, stabs, escapes, reloads, and keeps going. For some people, that is the appeal. There is a kind of rough entertainment in watching a hero who does not hesitate. Banning is written almost like a weapon with a pulse. He does not spend much time doubting himself or questioning the situation. If someone is between him and the president's survival, that person is removed from the story very quickly. But the violence in London Has Fallen is also where the movie becomes uncomfortable for a lot of viewers. It is not just violent. It has a certain glee in the violence. the film often seems to enjoy the brutality more than it needs to. The gunfights are heavy, the body count is massive, and some moments feel designed less for tension and more for shock value. That is where the tone gets messy. A hard action film can be brutal and still feel disciplined. Here, the brutality sometimes feels like the movie is trying to prove how tough it is. The torture elements, the aggressive killings, the constant bloodshed, it can move from exciting into excessive pretty quickly. And then there is the spectacle. London Has Fallen wants every major action beat to feel huge. It does not want a small threat or a contained danger. It wants landmarks under attack, streets in panic, leaders killed, buildings exploding, and an entire city transformed into a battlefield. The scale is part of the sell. Some of those images work. The idea of London becoming empty, unsafe, and hostile does create an eerie atmosphere. The city feels like a maze where every uniform could hide an enemy and every road could lead into another ambush. But the spectacle is also so exaggerated that it can become numb. When the movie keeps throwing destruction at the screen, the impact starts to wear down. A single explosion can be shocking. 10 explosions in a row start to feel like background noise. That is the strange problem with this kind of action. The movie is never short on incident, but incident is not the same thing as suspense. A car chase can be exciting if you feel danger. A shootout can be tense if the geography is clear and the stakes feel real. An explosion can land if the moment has build-up. London Has Fallen has plenty of these ingredients, but it does not always shape them into memorable set pieces. Sometimes the action feels less choreographed and more assembled from familiar action movie parts. Still, there are moments where the sheer momentum carries it. Even when the logic is gone, the film keeps pushing. And if you are in the right mood, that can be enough. You stop asking whether anyone should survive this and just accept that Banning is going to bulldoze his way through another wave of enemies. That is probably the fairest way to judge the action here. It is not refined, it is not especially clever, it is not always believable, and it is definitely not restrained, but it is forceful. London Has Fallen gives action fans a lot of what they expect. Gunfire, chases, explosions, close combat, desperate escapes, and a hero who keeps moving no matter how ridiculous the situation becomes. Whether that feels thrilling or exhausting depends on how much noise, violence, and impossible survival you are willing to accept before the spectacle starts losing its punch. Visually, London Has Fallen is one of those movies that feels much bigger than it sometimes looks. And that sounds strange, but if you've seen the film, you probably know exactly what I mean. The ambition is huge. This movie wants to sell the idea that one of the world's most recognizable cities has been thrown into chaos. World leaders are under attack, landmarks are being destroyed, streets are becoming war zones, and London itself is supposed to feel like a city under siege. On paper, that's a massive canvas for an action thriller. Sometimes the movie actually pulls it off. There are shots throughout the film where the scale works. Seeing familiar locations suddenly emptied, threatened, or damaged creates a genuine sense of unease. Even if you know you're watching a big studio action movie, there's something naturally unsettling about watching a major world capital transformed into a combat zone. Those moments give the film a larger identity beyond just another hero protects the president story. The problem is that the visual execution can be surprisingly inconsistent. There were scenes where I thought, okay, this looks pretty good. Then a few minutes later, another effect would show up and completely pull me out of the experience. It's almost like two different movies are competing with each other. One wants to look like a large-scale action blockbuster, while the other occasionally drifts into territory that feels much cheaper than the movie's ambitions. The CGI is probably where opinions split the most. Some viewers will look at the destruction sequences and see exactly what they came for: collapsing structures, explosions, large-scale attacks, and enough visual chaos to support the movie's over-the-top premise. If you're mainly focused on momentum, those effects do the job. But if you're paying close attention, some of the visual effects can feel surprisingly artificial. There are moments where the destruction looks less convincing than it should, especially considering the scale the movie is aiming for. Instead of feeling immersive, certain shots remind you that you're watching computer-generated spectacle, and once that illusion breaks, it can be hard to fully get back into the scene. The cinematography itself is functional more than memorable. It understands the assignment. The camera's job is to keep up with the action, follow Banning through dangerous situations, and maintain a sense of urgency. It rarely pauses to create visual beauty or atmosphere for its own sake. Everything is built around movement. That approach works when the action is flowing, but it also means the film sometimes sacrifices clarity. There are sequences where the camera becomes a little too energetic for its own good. The shaky cam style occasionally creeps in, and while it's clearly trying to increase intensity, it can have the opposite effect. Instead of making the action feel more immediate, it can make it harder to appreciate what's actually happening. Good action direction isn't just about speed, it's about letting the audience understand the geography of a scene. Who's where? Where's the threat? How does the hero escape? London Has Fallen occasionally loses some of that clarity in its rush to keep everything feeling urgent. What I did appreciate, though, was the atmosphere the film creates once the attack begins. There's a certain paranoia running through the visuals: empty roads, suspicious uniforms, streets that should feel safe suddenly feeling dangerous. The movie does a decent job of turning familiar environments into hostile territory. Even when the realism falls apart, that sense of uncertainty helps maintain tension. The musical score plays a similar role. It isn't trying to reinvent action thriller music. It mostly exists to keep the pressure on, to remind the audience that the situation is urgent and that danger is always nearby. It's effective in the moment, even if it isn't particularly memorable once the movie ends. And honestly, that describes a lot of the technical side of London Has Fallen. It's built around effectiveness rather than artistry. The visuals, the camera work, the score, the effects, they're all designed to serve momentum. The movie wants you moving from one crisis to the next, without stopping long enough to question how convincing everything looks. Sometimes that strategy works surprisingly well. Sometimes it feels like the film is trying to overwhelm you into accepting things that don't quite hold up under scrutiny. In the end, the technical presentation reflects the movie itself. Big ambitions, mixed execution, moments of genuine scale, moments that look cheaper than they should, and a constant determination to keep the audience focused on the next explosion before they have time to think about the last one. One of the reasons London Has Fallen ended up being such a divisive movie has very little to do with the action itself. It's the politics, or maybe more accurately, it's the way the movie handles politics without really seeming interested in exploring them. Now, to be fair, this isn't a political drama. Nobody is sitting down to watch a Gerard Butler action movie expecting a nuanced discussion about international relations. That's not the assignment. The film wants to entertain first and foremost, but even action movies create a worldview, whether they mean to or not, and London Has Fallen has a very specific one. The movie operates with a pretty straightforward us versus them mentality. There are heroes, there are villains, there are good guys protecting civilization and bad guys trying to destroy it. On a basic action movie level, that's completely normal. The problem is that the film rarely moves beyond that simplicity. As the story unfolds, entire institutions begin to look either incompetent or compromised. British security collapses with alarming speed, intelligence systems fail, police are infiltrated, emergency services are compromised. The city becomes vulnerable almost instantly. For the plot to work, nearly every layer of protection has to fall apart at the same time, and that creates a strange dynamic. Instead of feeling like an international crisis involving multiple countries and agencies, the movie increasingly starts to feel like a story where everyone fails except the American heroes. Whether intentional or not, that's the impression some viewers walked away with. It's one thing to make your hero look capable. It's another thing to make almost everyone else look incapable in order to accomplish it. That's where some of the criticism surrounding the film comes from. Then there's the dialogue. A few lines in particular stand out for all the wrong reasons. They're written as tough guy moments, the kind of one-liners that are supposed to get cheers from the audience. But instead of sounding clever or intimidating, they come across as unnecessarily crude and, in some cases, openly offensive. The issue isn't that the movie is politically incorrect. Plenty of action movies are politically incorrect. The issue is that some of these moments feel less like character development and more like cheap provocation. And because the film already leans heavily into a simplistic good versus evil framework, those lines end up reinforcing the idea that the movie isn't especially interested in complexity. It just wants the audience to know who they're supposed to root for and who they're supposed to hate. The villains don't help much in that regard either. The film gives them a motivation, technically. There is a revenge element tied to military action and personal loss. On paper, that's an opportunity to create a more layered conflict, a chance to explore consequences, resentment, or competing perspectives. But London Has Fallen never really follows that path. Instead, it uses that backstory mostly as fuel for another action scenario. The result is that the conflict stays broad and simplistic, even when there are moments where it could have become something more interesting. What's fascinating is that the movie occasionally acts as if it's making a serious statement. There are speeches, there are declarations about justice and morality, there are moments designed to feel emotionally triumphant. But because the film spends so little time engaging with the bigger issues it's touching on, those moments can feel oddly one-sided. The movie wants the satisfaction of a political payoff without doing much of the political work beforehand. And that's where reactions become incredibly divided. Some viewers don't care at all. For them, this is a loud action movie. The politics are background noise. The mission is simple: protect the president, stop the terrorists, save the day. Nothing more. Others find the political tone impossible to ignore because it's woven directly into the movie's identity. The nationalism, the rhetoric, the portrayal of institutions, the way certain characters are framed, it all becomes part of the viewing experience. Neither reaction is wrong. What makes London Has Fallen interesting is that it doesn't sit comfortably in either camp. It's too political to be completely apolitical, but not thoughtful enough to function as meaningful political commentary. It exists somewhere in the middle, part action fantasy, part nationalistic wish fulfillment, part revenge thriller, and depending on your perspective, that combination either feels harmlessly entertaining or surprisingly uncomfortable. The movie clearly knows what side it's on. The question is whether the audience is willing to follow it there. The villains in London Has Fallen are a perfect example of the movie almost having something interesting, then choosing the easiest version of it. On the surface, the conflict is not completely empty. The main threat is tied to revenge. Barkawi is not attacking London just because the movie needs a bad guy. He has a personal reason. His family was hit in a Western military strike, and the attack on the world leaders is framed as his response to that loss. That kind of setup can work. It gives the villain a motive beyond simple evil. It creates a sense of consequence. It suggests that violence creates more violence, and that one act of destruction can return later in a much bigger, uglier form. But London Has Fallen does not really sit with that idea. It introduces the revenge angle, then mostly uses it as a reason to start the action. After that, Barkawi becomes less of a character and more of a remote control mastermind. He is there to organize the chaos, threaten the president, and give Banning a target to push toward. And that is where the villain side of the movie feels thin. The plan itself is enormous, almost absurdly enormous. Terrorists have infiltrated London on a scale that feels impossible. They are inside police units, emergency response systems, security routes, and every major point where the heroes might try to escape. They do not just attack, they seem to have predicted every possible move. At first, that makes them look dangerous. After a while, it makes the writing look lazy. Because if the villains are everywhere at all times, danger stops feeling carefully built and starts feeling automatic. The movie can place enemies in any scene because the plan is so ridiculously wide-reaching that it covers everything. It is convenient more than clever. The terrorist enemies themselves are also not especially memorable. Most of them are bodies for Banning to fight through. They appear, shoot, chase, die, and get replaced by more men with guns. There is not much personality there. They are less like characters and more like obstacles in a violent video game level. That works if the goal is pure action, but it does not create a strong central conflict. A great action villain does not just create danger. He gives the hero something to push against emotionally, morally, or personally. Here, Barkawi has the outline of that kind of villain, but not the depth. The movie gives him grief, anger, and revenge, but it does not explore those feelings with enough weight to make him unforgettable. The conflict is also very one-sided in the way it is presented. The film clearly wants us to understand that the villains are cruel and dangerous, which is expected. But because it does not develop them beyond the basic terrorist mastermind framework, the story loses a chance to become more complicated. There was room here for a more uncomfortable, more layered revenge thriller. Instead, the movie keeps things broad and simple, and maybe that was intentional. London Has Fallen is not trying to be a thoughtful study of violence and retaliation. It is trying to be a hard, direct action movie where the villain sets the trap and the hero breaks through it. On that level, the villains do their job. They create the crisis. They raise the stakes. They give Banning endless enemies to destroy. But as characters, they are weak. They feel generic, sometimes cartoonish, and often too perfectly organized to believe. Barkawi's revenge story gives the film a slightly stronger starting point than a completely random terrorist plot, but the movie never turns that into real dramatic tension. So the conflict ends up being functional rather than memorable. It gets the movie moving. It gives the hero something to fight, but it never becomes as sharp, personal, or meaningful as it could have been. When it comes to the performances in London Has Fallen, I think the movie survives largely because the cast understands exactly what kind of film they're in. Nobody is trying to turn this into a deep character study. Nobody is delivering award season material. Most of the actors seem to recognize that the movie's primary mission is to keep the action moving, and they adjust their performances accordingly. That starts with Gerard Butler. At this point, Butler doesn't really play Mike Banning so much as he embodies him. The character is basically a combination of loyalty, aggression, determination, and stubbornness compressed into human form. He's constantly running, fighting, shooting, yelling, surviving, and protecting the president. There isn't a huge emotional range required here, but Butler commits to the physicality of the role completely. And honestly, that's a big reason the franchise works at all. Because when you stop and think about what Banning survives in these movies, the character becomes almost impossible to take seriously. He walks away from situations that should end anyone's story. Yet Butler sells it with enough confidence that you eventually stop questioning it and just accept that this guy apparently exists in a different reality than everyone else. The interesting thing is that Banning isn't a particularly unique action hero on paper. He's not especially witty. He's not mysterious. He doesn't have a memorable personality quirk that separates him from dozens of other action protagonists. In many ways, he's a familiar tough guy archetype, but Butler's screen presence does a lot of the heavy lifting. Even when the dialogue gets clunky or the situations become absurd, he has enough natural charisma to keep the character watchable. Whether you enjoy the movie or not, it's difficult to deny that he's giving it everything he's got. Aaron Eckhart has a much more difficult assignment. President Asher spends most of the film reacting to events rather than driving them. He's the person everyone is trying to save, which automatically limits how active he can be within the story. As a result, Eckhart often feels trapped inside the role. That's not necessarily his fault. The script doesn't give him a huge amount to work with beyond looking concerned, staying alive, and reminding us of what's at stake. He performs the role professionally, but it's not a character the movie seems especially interested in developing. He's important to the plot, but not always memorable as a character. What stood out to me more was how much potential the supporting cast had. This movie is filled with recognizable actors. Morgan Freeman, Angela Bassett, Melissa Leo, Robert Forster, and several others bring a level of credibility that instantly elevates the cast list. These are performers who can add weight to almost anything they're in. The problem is that London Has Fallen rarely knows what to do with them. Morgan Freeman probably comes out the best because he naturally brings authority and calm to every scene. Even when he isn't doing much, he has a presence that makes people listen. The movie benefits from that, but at the same time, his role feels surprisingly limited. Much of what he's asked to do involves reacting to information, managing the crisis from a distance, and looking appropriately concerned. You keep waiting for him to become more central to the story, and that moment never fully arrives. The same issue affects Angela Bassett and several others. They're there, they're professional, they do exactly what's required, but many of these characters feel like they're serving plot functions rather than existing as complete people. Sometimes it feels like talented actors have been assigned the job of standing in a command room and delivering updates, while Banning handles everything important elsewhere. And that's a shame because the cast is arguably stronger than the screenplay. You can see glimpses of what these performers could bring to richer material, but the movie never really creates space for them. What's funny is that even some of the weaker performances aren't necessarily bad. They're just trapped inside characters that don't have much depth. A great actor can only do so much when the script's main concern is getting to the next explosion. That's really the story of the performances as a whole. Nobody embarrasses themselves. Nobody completely steals the movie either. The cast does exactly what this type of action film asks them to do. Keep the audience invested enough between action scenes that the momentum never disappears. Gerard Butler carries the weight of the film on his shoulders. Aaron Eckhart provides a steady presence beside him. The supporting cast adds credibility whenever they appear. It's a solid ensemble trapped inside a movie that is far more interested in action than character. And maybe that's why the performances work better than some other parts of the film. The actors seem to understand the assignment. Even when the movie occasionally loses its mind, they keep playing it straight. The supporting cast in London Has Fallen is one of those things that looks impressive on paper, then feels strangely underused once the movie actually gets going. You look at the names involved and think, okay, this should give the film some weight. Morgan Freeman, Angela Bassett, Melissa Leo, Robert Forster, Jackie Earle Haley. These are not empty background players. These are actors who can bring authority, personality, and texture into scenes without needing much screen time. And yet, the movie often treats them like expensive furniture in a crisis room. That sounds harsh, but it is kind of true. Most of the supporting characters are there to react, report, worry, or deliver information, while Mike Banning is out in the field doing the real work. They sit around tables. They stare at screens. They exchange serious looks. They say things that remind us the situation is bad, then the movie cuts back to Gerard Butler fighting through London. It is functional, sure, but it is not very satisfying. Morgan Freeman probably gets the best treatment out of the supporting cast, mostly because Morgan Freeman can make almost anything sound important. Even when he is not given a lot to do, he still brings calm authority to the room. His presence helps the movie feel slightly bigger and more official than it might have otherwise. But even with him, there is a feeling of limitation. He is important in title, important in tone, but not always important in dramatic action. The movie keeps him at a distance from the main danger, which makes sense for the structure, but it also means his role becomes more symbolic than emotionally involving. Angela Bassett has a stronger connection to the immediate crisis because her character is right there in the protection detail. She brings intensity and command, and you can feel that the film benefits from her presence. But again, the writing does not give her enough room. The character could have added a stronger emotional layer to the survival mission, especially because she is part of Banning's world, not just someone watching events unfold from safety. Melissa Leo, Robert Forster, and Jackie Earle Haley face the same problem in different ways. They are recognizable, capable actors, but the movie uses them mainly to fill out the political and security machinery around the plot. They give the film a sense of scale, like there are serious people handling serious decisions, but their individual characters do not leave much of a mark. That is the real missed opportunity. A film like this does not need every supporting character to have a giant emotional arc. Nobody is asking for a slow, character-driven drama in the middle of an action sequel. But a few sharper moments could have made the whole world feel more alive. A stronger line here, a more personal reaction there, maybe a small conflict between decision-makers, something to remind us these are people, not just job titles. Instead, the film mostly saves its energy for Banning, and that makes the supporting cast feel trapped in orbit around him. Everyone exists to underline the seriousness of the mission, but very few of them get to shape the mission in a memorable way. It is not that the performances are bad. Actually, that is the frustrating part. The actors are too good for how little they are given. They bring professionalism, authority, and presence, but the screenplay does not meet them halfway. So the supporting cast becomes one of the film's strange contradictions. It has enough recognizable talent to suggest a richer, more layered action thriller, but the movie itself is too impatient to use that talent properly. In the end, these actors help the film feel more respectable than the material sometimes deserves. But they also remind you of the better version of London has fallen that could have existed if the script had cared about the people in the room as much as the man holding the gun. One area where London has fallen really struggles is the dialogue, and what's interesting is that the movie clearly thinks some of these lines are going to be crowd pleasers. You can almost feel it. Certain moments are written like the audience is supposed to lean forward, smile, and think, yeah, that's a cool line. Instead, a lot of them land somewhere between awkward, forced, and unintentionally funny. The biggest issue is that the movie mistakes toughness for personality. Mike Banning is written as a hard-edged action hero, which is perfectly fine. The problem is that the screenplay often reduces that toughness to profanity, threats, and one-liners that sound like they were pulled from a generic action movie handbook. Instead of revealing character, many of the lines simply remind us that Banning is supposed to be the toughest guy in the room. After a while, that starts to wear thin, because a memorable action hero doesn't just have tough dialogue. He has a voice, you know who he is from the way he talks. Think about the action icons people still quote years later. Their lines worked because they reflected personality. With Banning, the dialogue sometimes feels like it's trying too hard to manufacture those moments. There are scenes where he delivers a line that's clearly meant to sound intimidating, but the writing is so blunt that it becomes distracting. You don't think about the character. You think about the screenwriter trying to create a badass quote, and that's never a good sign. The excessive vulgarity doesn't help either. Now, strong language isn't automatically a problem. Plenty of action films use it effectively, but London has fallen leans on it so often that it starts feeling less like natural speech and more like a substitute for sharper writing. It's as if the movie assumes every sentence becomes more intense simply by making it louder. It doesn't. In fact, the opposite happens. When every other line is aggressive, the impact disappears. The dialogue becomes background noise. What makes this more frustrating is that Gerard Butler actually has enough charisma to sell better material. There are moments where you can see him trying to bring energy to lines that simply aren't that good. He commits fully, which is probably why some of the dialogue works better than it deserves to, but even he can't rescue every line. The film also has a habit of delivering political or moral statements that feel strangely disconnected from everything around them. There are moments where characters suddenly sound like they're stepping onto a soapbox. The movie pauses long enough to make a point, then immediately returns to explosions and gunfire. Those scenes never quite land because the script hasn't earned them. A speech can be powerful when it grows naturally from a character and a story. Here, some of those moments feel inserted because the movie thinks it needs a dramatic statement before moving on to the next action sequence. And then there are the one-liners. Some action movies live and die on one-liners. They become part of the fun. They give the audience something to remember. London Has Fallen definitely wants those moments. Sometimes they work in a dumb, guilty pleasure way. You hear the line, roll your eyes a little, and move on. That's part of the charm of certain action films. Other times, they're so overcooked that they pull you right out of the movie. The strange thing is that very few characters actually have distinct voices. Most people speak in the language of the plot. They deliver information. They explain threats. They report developments. The dialogue often functions as a tool rather than a reflection of personality. That's especially noticeable with the supporting cast. You have talented actors throughout the movie, but many of them are stuck saying things that sound interchangeable. Remove the character names, and you could swap entire conversations between different people without changing much. That's usually a sign that the writing isn't doing enough work. And yet, despite all these issues, the dialogue isn't completely ineffective. It serves the movie's larger goal, which is speed. The script rarely slows down to explore character through conversation because it is always racing toward the next action sequence. The dialogue exists to keep the engine running. That's probably the best way to understand it. London Has Fallen doesn't treat dialogue as an opportunity for depth. It treats dialogue as connective tissue between explosions. Sometimes that creates unintentionally funny moments. Sometimes it creates eye-rolling one-liners. Sometimes it produces speeches that sound more important than they actually are. But very rarely does it create memorable character voice. The movie wants its characters to sound tough. The problem is that sounding tough and sounding authentic are not always the same thing. There is a very specific kind of pleasure in watching London Has Fallen, and it has almost nothing to do with prestige filmmaking. This is not polished, elegant, serious action cinema. Not really. It feels much closer to an old-school B-movie that somehow found itself wearing a bigger budget and a more recognizable cast. And honestly, that might be the best way to understand why some people enjoy it. London Has Fallen has that shameless Cannon-style energy. The politics are blunt, the villains are broad, the hero is nearly indestructible. The violence is excessive. The plot is simple enough to explain in one sentence. It is the kind of movie where subtlety does not just leave the room, it was never invited in the first place. That can be a weakness, obviously. But it can also be the entire appeal, because there are viewers who do not come to a movie like this looking for realism or nuance. They want a hard, cheesy, aggressive action ride where the hero growls his way through danger and the bad guys keep arriving just so they can be knocked down. On that level, London Has Fallen knows its audience pretty well. The Millennium Films flavor is all over it. It has that modern version of the old B-grade action machine. Recognizable stars, big threats, loud set pieces, familiar formulas, and just enough production value to make the whole thing feel larger than its script probably deserves. It is not trying to reinvent the action genre. It is trying to feed people who already like this kind of thing, and there is something weirdly honest about that. The movie does not waste much time pretending to be more sophisticated than it is. Once the attack begins, it basically becomes a checklist of action movie pleasures. Gunfire, explosions, narrow escapes, tough guy lines, impossible survival, and one man solving an international crisis with bullets and rage. If that sounds ridiculous, it is, but that ridiculousness is part of the texture. The problem is that B-movie fun works best when the film has a little self-awareness. London Has Fallen sometimes feels like it might be in on the joke, but not consistently enough. There are moments so over the top that they almost become hilarious, and you start wondering whether the movie is intentionally leaning into exploitation absurdity. Then another scene arrives, completely serious, completely straight-faced, and suddenly you're not sure anymore. That uncertainty is what makes the film such a strange watch. If it fully embraced its trashy action identity, it might have been easier to celebrate as pure guilty pleasure. If it tried harder to be grounded, it might have worked better as a thriller. Instead, it lives somewhere in the middle, too silly to be taken seriously, but too serious to feel completely playful. Still, for fans of loud B-movie action, there is a kind of comfort here. Same type of hero, same type of mission, same type of enemies, same type of destruction. Nothing too surprising, nothing too complicated. The movie gives you exactly what you expect, almost proudly, and maybe that is why it has defenders, not because it is great, not because it is smart, but because it scratches a very specific itch. It feels like a throwback to a time when action movies could be crude, blunt, oversized, and completely convinced that a tough guy with a gun could fix almost anything. London Has Fallen is not a refined action thriller. It is a glorified B-movie with blockbuster ambitions, and depending on your taste, that is either the problem or the reason to watch it. So where does that leave London Has Fallen? Honestly, it depends on how much nonsense you're willing to forgive in the name of action, because this is not a film that meets everyone halfway. It does not gently invite you in. It basically kicks the door open, throws logic out the window, fires a few hundred rounds, blows up half of London, and then asks if you're entertained. Some viewers will say yes, and I get it. There is a certain blunt enjoyment in watching a movie this committed to its own chaos. It is fast, loud, violent, simple, and completely uninterested in subtlety. Gerard Butler knows how to carry this kind of material, and once the action starts, the film rarely gives you time to be bored. For the right audience, that is enough. If you want a popcorn action thriller where the hero keeps moving, the enemies keep coming, and the story never gets more complicated than protect the president and kill the bad guys, London Has Fallen does exactly what it promises. Not elegantly, not intelligently, but directly. But if you need the movie to make sense, even a little, it becomes much harder to defend. The plot is absurd, the politics are clumsy, the villains are thin. The dialogue often sounds like it was trying too hard to be tough. The supporting cast is better than the material, and the action, while constant, can feel more exhausting than exciting. There are moments where the film is so ridiculous that it almost becomes fun by accident, but there are also moments where the uglier edges make that fun harder to enjoy. That is why the movie is so divisive. For some, it is trash. Loud, lazy, offensive, and impossible to believe. For others, it is enjoyable trash. A guilty pleasure B-movie with bigger explosions, recognizable actors, and just enough momentum to keep the ride moving. And maybe that is the fairest verdict. London Has Fallen is not good in the traditional sense. It is too messy, too exaggerated, too politically heavy-handed, and too predictable for that. But it is also not completely without appeal. It has energy, it has pace, it has a star who understands the job. It has that rough, old-school action flavor that certain viewers still enjoy. So no, this is not a smart sequel. It is not a refined thriller. It is not even always a well-made spectacle. But as a noisy, ridiculous, sometimes uncomfortable action ride, it has its audience. And whether you walk away entertained or irritated will probably be decided in the first major attack sequence. If you buy into the madness, you'll ride with it. If you don't, the rest of the movie is going to feel like a very long argument with common sense. London Has Fallen is exactly the kind of film people either defend as fun or dismiss as garbage. The strange part is, both sides have a point.